Hello, my name's Oluwatimi Osha. I'm continuing with my discussion of the Watergate scandal and the battle of the press that brought down the Nixon administration. Indeed, it was a study in Orwellian operation, right? Because you know George Orwell himself would have blushed at the sort of words that were conjured up. Of course, George Orwell is remarkable for having coined words like double speak in his book 1984. You should read it if you haven't read it. I've read it at least twice, and it's a masterpiece in political theater. Uh, you know, but pitted against one another, representing the Nixon administration was a 29-year-old inexperienced. He had no uh, experience as a journalist. He'd been an advertiser. That's Ron Ziegler. But he had some things going on for him in terms of resilience. He remained loyal and was the press secretary to Richard Nixon throughout his macabre and indeed Orwellian administration, and so he would, but he would end up, coining words, right? Coining words for the administration that have gone into, uh, the lexicon of journalism, such as photo op, right? He coined photo opportunity. We all know what a photo op is, so he came up with a photo op, and of course he coined. Um, he coined a phrase that was precursor to another infamous appellation that's um, uh, alternative facts, which was coined by Kellyanne Conway in the first administration of President Trump. That's number 45 or 47, when he was number 45. Of course, Kellyanne Conway is an alumna of my alma mater, George Washington University, and of course, which is right there, a neighbor of the White House, and right there at the heart of Foggy Bottom or a Georgetown, and that's sort of what I want to talk about today. I want to discuss the Georgetown elites, the liberal elites that took down that ended up taking down Nixon. Nixon, of course, was a Washington man. Nixon had spent his career he had been in the Navy, he'd been a congressman, he became a senator, he became a vice president. Had two terms as vice president of to President Eisenhower, and of course, then he became president, right? And then there was Watergate, right? There was Watergate and the role of the Washington Post. So the Washington Post was owned by the Meyer family. Catherine Meyer was the publisher at the time. Um, by the way, let me get back to the word phrase I was coined by. The phrase coined by Ron Ziegler, right? The 29-year-old Ron Ziegler. Well, he took the position at the age of 29 as chief press secretary. Um, and I think up until that time, he was the youngest press secretary we'd ever had. So he would use a phrase inoperative statement. Of course, it's inoperative statement because he kept coming up with all these um, walkbacks, right, and convoluted statements that contradicted earlier, statements that he'd made, denying the White House knowledge or involvement with the Watergate break-in. But as the Washington Post journalist Bernstein and Bob Woodward, as they would continue to doggedly investigate and publish new revelations linking the White House, exposing the slush fund, and going on, then and then with the trial and then confessions by people who had been bribed to be silent, to plead guilty. That's James McCord. Of course, James McCord later on in in 1973, he would write a letter to the judge, Judge John Sirica, and state that he committed perjury, but they'd been bribed, silenced by the White House to commit perjury, denying the involvement of higher ups in the government. And of course, all of this revelation and exposure would ultimately lead to the vindication of the Washington Post, right? And they would subsequently win a Pulitzer Prize for their meritorious service in journalism and reporting. Um, but why were even though they were attacked economically, they were smeared, they were threatened by the Nixon administration and his hacks. The Washington Post remained resilient, and it's interesting to look at the organization. So they were resourceful. It was owned by insiders, and that's what I want to discuss today. The Georgetown insiders, they were known as the Georgetown set, the elite, the insiders, they were liberals. Um, so at that time, it was run by Katherine Graham, right? Her maiden name was Meyer, and her father had been Eugene Meyer. Her father was the first World Bank president, and it was at this time that I think, maybe at his time as World Bank president or as his time as chairman of the Federal Reserve, he was also chairman of the Federal Reserve, that he let his son-in-law, Philip Graham, who was a Harvard Law graduate, right? He let him run the the Washington Post. So the Washington Post had been bought by Eugene Meyer, right, who was a multimillionaire financier as well, apart from being chairman of the Federal Reserve at some point. And he bought it in 1933 in a bankruptcy sale. Uh, and his daughter's husband, Philip Graham, right? So Philip Graham was married to Catherine, the daughter of Eugene Meyer, would run the business. And of course, he made some changes. Eventually, um, let me give the background. Actually, it's kind of interesting. So Philip Graham was running the Washington Post, right? And they bought a number of radio stations and TV stations as well. They had a number of media affiliated channels related to the Washington Post, but their mainstay, of course, was the Washington Post, the journalism, the reporting. That was a big deal. Um, Philip Graham was actually a close friend of John Kennedy, right? John F. Kennedy. And he was one who apparently persuaded John F. Kennedy to have Lyndon Johnson on his presidential ticket in 1960. And he actually persuaded Kennedy also to hire Dillon as his Treasury Secretary. So um, he's kind of interesting because this is I should also touch on this because this is May. We're in the month of May. This is Mental Health Awareness Month. He was a brilliant man, but he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and he would eventually die by suicide in August 1963, just a few months before John F. Kennedy's assassination in November 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, by Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, however, John F. Kennedy would attend the funeral um, of Philip Graham, right, who was the publisher of the Post at the time. It's interesting that Philip Graham would suffer prior to the funeral, just not long before. Um, I think was he started an affair in 1962 with an Austrian journalist named Robin Webb, and he was planning on marrying her. He was planning on divorcing his wife and marrying her. Then he changed his mind, but at some point he had a manic episode, right? He broke down, had a manic episode. He was diagnosed with, it was called manic, it used to be called manic depression. It's, it's now called bipolar disorder, right? He had a manic episode at a newspaper convention, right? He was a publisher, a newspaper convention, in which he started talking. He went manic. He had some kind of mania, and he revealed that he got the mic, and he revealed that John F. Kennedy, the president, was having an affair, was sleeping with a woman called a Washington socialite named Mary Anno Pinchot Meyer, long name, right? I guess they include her Anno Pinchot because um, her parents were very wealthy New Yorkers, right? Anno Pinchot, right? Anno, her mother's parents, and then Pinchot, her dad. Pinchot was a wealthy lawyer who came from, he was Yale educated, came from a wealthy family as well in New York. They both came from wealthy families. It's interesting that she would, so he exposed this, but let me quickly just mention the strange thing about Mary Ann Pinchot Meyer, right? So she was indeed having an affair with John F. Kennedy. And it's interesting that she was married to a guy called Cord Meyer, right? Not a relation, at least not that I know of Catherine Meyer. Of course, the maiden name of Philip Graham's wife, Catherine was Meyer, right? So Mary Ann Pinchot Meyer had been married to Cord Meyer. Cord Meyer also came from a wealthy family, very wealthy family, New York family. But he, interestingly, was was a career CIA officer, and he was a high up CIA officer, and he was very close to a guy called James Jesus Angleton. I've done videos discussing James Jesus Angleton, who was head of the counterintelligence operation of the CIA. And many people suspect that he had JFK killed, that he orchestrated the assassination of JFK. He was always looking for a mole. I've argued that I don't think so, but that's the popular opinion amongst historians of the JFK assassination conspiracy today. And in fact, Cord Meyer, right? Cord Meyer, the husband um, of Mary Anno Pinchot Meyer, um, is suspected to have been involved in the assassination of JFK. But interestingly, after JFK was assassinated, long after Philip Graham, committed suicide in August 1963. JFK was assassinated in November 22nd, 1963. His apparent killer, Lee Harvey Oswald, was killed by Jack Ruby 2 days later. Um, it's interesting that the wife of Cord Meyer, the CIA officer, right, the former wife of the CIA officer, was assassinated in Georgetown, right, in Georgetown at a canal, the Chesapeake Canal, in Georgetown in October 1964, and it remains an unresolved murder. In any event, Ben Bradley was her brother-in-law. Ben Bradley was Mary Anno Pinchot Meyer's brother-in-law, and he was also the executive editor of the Washington Post, right? And he was the boss of Bernstein and Bernstein and Woodward, who were dogged about uncovering the Watergate connection to Richard Nixon. So Ben Bradley would discover that James Jesus Angleton, his name was actually Jesus, had broken into the home of the murdered Mary Anno Pinchot Meyer. Apparently, he was searching for her diary because it revealed details of the affair of John F. Kennedy, and maybe to also, to hide something else, right? So all of that scandal, right? A lot of stuff going on. So you can see the intrigue in Washington. So you can just see how all those people were sort of connected. So interestingly, as I mentioned, that um, when Philip Graham, right, while he was having an affair, and he went to this convention with his mistress, the Austrian journalist, and he revealed that, on a hot mic, deliberately on a mic at this newspaper convention, that John F. Kennedy was sleeping with Mary Ann O'Pincher he was, it was clear he was having a manic episode, and so his doctor was called, and so they sedated him and put him in this, they put him in a straitjacket. They literally put him in a straitjacket, and then they flew him to Rockville, Maryland, where they institutionalized him in a psychiatric hospital. That was the publisher of the Washington Post, Philip Graham, right? Um, and he would change his will, right, and make it in 1963, and make it favor. He would alter his will and make it favor his mistress that he said he wanted to marry. That's Robin Webb. But he would commit suicide on August 3, uh, uh, on August 1963, at his farmhouse in Virginia. But he would die interstate because Katherine Graham, his wife, would challenge the will, right? The wealth of Washington Post actually really came from her father. She owned 30% of it, right? And the 70% had actually been purchased with the help of her father, because her father owned the Post, and he helped Philip Graham, her husband, her late husband, purchase it. But now he wanted to, leave his estate to his mistress, right? So, fortunately for her, though, his lawyer had indicated that he only altered the will. He indicated he altered the will because of their friendship. He didn't want to damage their friendship, but he noted that he was mentally ill. Now, under the law, right, somebody who's mentally ill, severely mentally ill, or is not of sound mind, they can't legally make a binding document, right? They can't enter into a contract, right? Because they lack capacity. So he was not of sound mind, and so he died interstate, right? In probate, he was considered to have died interstate. Interstate means without a valid will, and so the Washington Post ownership went to Katherine Graham, and she made a concession that okay, that the ownership would be shared jointly by her and her children, right? So not his mistress, right? So that's how she maintained control of the Washington Post and the associated companies. So it's uh, it's kind of interesting how she was able to manage it well. Her son also would later die by suicide as well. Her son uh, would also suffer from bipolar disorder, and at least, well, he did die by suicide as well. That's one of the dangers about manic depression. That's what it was called then. Remember, historians and psychologists today say people like Abraham Lincoln did struggle with um, manic depression. Recently, Ted Turner, the founder of CNN, died. It's interesting. He did admit that he struggled with manic depression, bipolar disorder. He struggled with it. It's funny. I'd read his biography when I was young in Nigeria, and the way he started CNN. That's Ted Turner, right? Who was a big publisher, broadcaster as well. He, the founder of CNN. The way he started was kind of bizarre. I think they had initially started reporting as a channel, that showed wrestling matches and things like that, and they'd read the news. They experimented with all sorts of stuff, and he did weird things, like really crazy things while he was reporting. Like he could have a paper bag on his head. He'd just do crazy stuff while he was reporting, right? And but close to the end of his life, that's Ted Turner. He would suffer dementia, right? He would have dementia. So it's kind, but he did live a long life because he just died recently. He died, this year. Uh, and because I know there's been stuff all over the news just commemorating his life. Um, so that's the interesting, the interesting connection of the Washington Post. As I said, Ben Bradley himself. Ben Bradley, I think many of us would remember him from reporting. I think Ben Bradley lived till 2014, but at the time he was the executive editor of the Washington Post. He's Harvard educated as well. And his sister-in-law he was married to the sister of Mary Eno Pinchot Meyer, right, who had been married to a CIA officer who was very closely connected to James Jesus Angleton, uh, the head of the CIA counterintelligence unit, who was said to have been involved in the assassination, orchestrated the assassination of JFK. Now, of course, Clyde Meyer's wife had been, sleeping with JFK, and Philip Graham, who was the publisher of the Washington Post at the time, would reveal this publicly at a newspaper convention. So, hey, um, this was in 1963, 1962, stroke 1963, right? Just 1963 when he revealed this, and so it's kind of funny. But so that was about almost a decade before the Watergate scandal. But Katherine Graham, his wife, would manage the Washington Post very admirably. And it's interesting that she didn't want to know, despite all the pressure, because she couldn't have known if um, the reporters, that's and Bernstein and Woodward, were following a positive lead, right? Because nobody knew who the source was. Nobody knew who Deep Throat was, who was leaking the information, right? I've done a video about Mark Felt. Mark Felt was Deep Throat, and he was the one who was the number two guy at the FBI, and he was telling them follow the money. He was telling Bob Woodward. He was said to have told Bob Woodward to follow the money, right? And that's how they discovered the hush money, right? And that was linked to that was run by the hush money from the slush fund that was run by John Mitchell, who'd been the Attorney General under Richard Nixon. And it's funny that Katherine Graham, she spoke with them, was it January 1973 at the beginning, and she didn't want to know who the source was, and she showed so much confidence in the journalists. She didn't stop them, despite the fact that her newspaper, the value had been slashed by over 50%, right, from $38 to roughly $16, and they were, the government, Florida administration was threatening to revoke their the licenses of their TV stations in Florida, right? And they, and it was costing them over $1 million in legal fees. In today's money, that's about almost $8 million in today's money, right? The legal fees that they paid in the 2.5 years trying to get their licenses for their TV stations in Florida renewed, right? So it was an indirect attack by the Nixon administration to get them to back off Watergate. But she was dogged, resilient. People say that she hated Richard Nixon. Of course, she had this strong liberal Washington insider backing. People say she hated Richard Nixon, and but at least that's what Senator Bob Dole, who supported Richard Nixon, the conservative, that's what he said publicly, that it was a personal attack. That she was the one who was really sicking her journalists on Richard Nixon, but no, they were actually being faithful patriots. They were, in fact, at that time, they were being accused of not being patriots, right? Because they were refusing to back off the Watergate scandal because the White House was lying. They were gaslighting America at that time. But fortunately, they continued. And I haven't, I haven't talked about the background of the journalists themselves. Um, it's interesting that Carl Bernstein, right? He actually attended. He started as a journalist at the age of 16, really young, and he attended University of Maryland at College Park. But he was dismissed for poor grades, for failing grades. He graduated from Montgomery Blair High School, which is a high school in popular high school in Silver Spring. Um, I don't know if Dave Chappelle went to Montgomery Blair. I can't remember. Um, and Bob Woodward himself uh, graduated from Yale, was a Yale graduate, got a bachelor's from Yale. But it's interesting that Carl Bernstein, even though he didn't do well in college, he won all sorts of awards early for his writing style. Right, he was one of the best, writing stylists at the Washington Post. I'm going to stop this video now. I think I've said enough about the organization of the Washington Post. It's interesting that the Maya Graham family doesn't own the Washington Post anymore. They sold it in 2013, like October 2013, to the billionaire and once richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, for $250 million. That's $250 million. So it's owned by Bezos now. Hopefully, Jeff Bezos is able to allow freedom of the press. By the way, I did take a course in law school. First Amendment, of course, the First Amendment covers the freedom of speech and the press. So I took a First Amendment course in law school. That's the speech and press clauses. And, so this is kind of interesting to me. My name is Olurotimi Osha, and I will keep you posted. Thank you.